You mentioned in your research paper that tax reform is a constant part of the forefront of the policy agenda, particularly in Western countries. Why is it in particular that Western countries can't leave tax policy alone?
I mean, there are probably many reasons for that. One is to some extent the political reasons. We are in the UK. There are political parties have different explicit objectives, and tax policies kind of usually conservatives and Republicans say that we are not going to increase taxes. We are not for redistributions. We go for efficiency. While more traditional left-wing parties, for them, redistribution is an important concept, and then providing public goods is an important one. So there is a political risk because whenever there is a change of power in the parliament, there would be a potential. I mean, the UK is very, very clean example. If it's in the manifesto, they better do it. And given they have a very clear identity, ideological identity in terms of social values, identity in terms of value for the distribution, that is going to lead to a need for changing the tax system. Then it can, how exactly, all the details, they are not in the manifesto. That's really the job of economists together with the politicians to figure out the exact how. That's one reason. The second reason that the world is changing around us. So the fact that there is an aging society makes us to worry about reforming social security. The old ways of social security is not necessarily sustainable. The increase of the so-called gig economy. There are many people are paid differently. They are not have full-time jobs. They have many small jobs. This is also very different in terms of social security and how you want to tax them. So these are things that change. They were not the same 30 years ago, and they will require constantly thinking about the best way of raising revenue, the best way of finding the balance between redistribution and efficiency. So this is changing all the time. But there are other reasons, but and the world is changing in many other ways. Remember, we had VAT is a big thing in many countries. And now with online shopping, this is a bit different. Europe changed a lot because you can shop anywhere in Europe online, and this is a free movement of goods. But can you have a national system of taxes? There are a lot of. I just mentioned three things which are very clear or changes in the environment, which make us to think about how we should design taxes. But the political one is the clear one. In terms of tax uncertainty, the political one is the clearest one because it's coming back. Political parties change every 4, 8, 12 years, and then most often there is a tax reform coming with that.
Sure, and certainly two of those things that you mentioned there are certainly things that I see when I see tax policy being brought up at the political stage. On one hand, it's one of the main levers, whether that be from a macroeconomic spend or a micro sense. If a government's coming in and they're saying that we're going to be different from what has been going on in the past, it's one of the levers you have to pull. And almost in some regard, you almost have to be seen to be doing something that's going to be different, that's going to make change. And that cannot potentially lead to some nuances in how, and how tax policy changes over time. The other side is the point you mentioned is the world is changing. People's mobility is a lot different. The administration of taxes that we have, whether that be capital or income or consumption taxes, sin taxes, is so different to the way it was, 10 years ago, let alone 40 years ago, right? And so I think, at least from my perspective, it seems to be these two factors in particular that sort of really highlight these two things. Generally speaking, when you were setting out the objectives for your research, what were you trying to achieve and what were you trying to look at in particular and try and solve?
For this type of research, I think usually there is a combination of three things, and I really don't want to order them, so just don't take them in order because
Sure.
I may regret it. So one is, to some extent, some intellectual curiosity. At the end, research is about intellectual curiosity. So I really see that. So that is one example. Take Social Security. This is a very recent project. I did work on it yesterday. So in that project. So in the United States, you see that Social Security is very progressive in one particular sense. If you are a low-income person in your lifetime sense, in your working life, you were among the lower earners, you get a high replacement rate through the public pension system. High replacement rate means that you get very close to your average income as pensions. But if you are a high income person, this replacement rate is much lower. So we want to understand why. What is the rationale to make this? It seems to be kind of creating redistribution through the pension system. Why do you want to do it? This is an intellectual curiosity. The second one is also very good in this example. Look at the real world. Look at institutions and try to think why they are there and how to make them better. At the end, as a macroeconomics policy type of researcher, the purpose is that, okay, there are existing institutions. Is there a way to make them better in terms of either delivering better outcomes, let's say, in social insurance or redistribution, or making them less distortionary? The problem is all the policies we talk about taxes, social security, and many other policies, we call them distortionary economics. Why? The higher the taxes, the more progressive is the tax system, the bigger this incentive is provides for the high earners to work hard and contribute to the economy and contribute to the total budget, for example. So this is kind of the balance. You really have to, in public economics and public macroeconomics, you always go back to the main question. What is the best way to balance policies in terms of giving the right outcomes in terms of inequality, distribution, and making the smallest amount of distortions given how much distribution you want. And that balance is always tricky to achieve because
But also the pragmatism. So you for example you talk about there about finding the balance between redistribution and then incentivizing growth. The other side to this, I was thinking as well, is what's pragmatically possible. You might set it. I'll set a hypothetical amount of 40% taxes on the rich and 20% taxes on those on lower incomes. But if we live in a society where the economy is becoming much more digital, people are becoming much more nomadic. People quite frequently will live in multiple countries over their life potentially instead of just one. It suddenly becomes a lot harder and also more costly, I think, is what people don't necessarily appreciate, to administer those taxes. If you're going to have more stringent controls and more stringent legislation around these things become more costly for a variety of reasons. One, communicating that to everybody. You add more complexity into things. People have to be more educated, and so tax lawyers and tax planners can charge more for certain facilities and things like that. So on one hand, it's the redistribution question, and almost at the shared utilization question of almost like a prisoner's dilemma, trying to force cooperation in certain activities. The fire department being an example of that, but then also just the pragmatic implementation of certain policy. Like, can you effectively do it? And if you can do it, should you do it? Because is it going to be more costly than beneficial to that system to be able to manifest it?
I agree completely. And indeed, you see, I'm to some extent in my heart, I'm a theorist. So I see what you said, pragmatism is part of the distortions because compliance is some margin which can be distorted. So of course, and there were examples, there are kind of famous examples in Nordic countries. I think it happened in Norway, but could have been Sweden. I don't remember which one, when they introduced a new wealth tax. And a significant one. It's not kind of 10%, by the way. For wealth tax, already 1 or 5% is significant because of. So they introduced that. And there were huge among the very top, like think about top 0.1% or even 0.04. So at the very, very top, they see a significant movement of moving their money, enterprise, legally and illegally to offshore accounts. So meaning taking residence of their company. So that exists. So you really, and as you said, people are mobile, both mobile in terms of their businesses, but in the more narrow sense in terms of where they locate their finances and where they keep their money. And there is a lot of evidence of the very rich, the extreme rich, are very, very elastic. The very high tax rates of capital income or wealth may move them to offshore accounts. So this is kind of one of the challenges. Without huge international cooperation and to some extent enforcement, it's very, very costly to tax the very rich because they will just move away. They just move somewhere when they don't have to pay their taxes. And there are a lot of advantages to have a very open and mobile economy. This is kind of a side effect that it makes taxing the rich who will have the resources, all the lawyers, all the financial companies, all the financial advisors, they will able to find a way to kind of pay less taxes. And that is the global minimum tax is going into this direction. I'm not so sure whether we have good enough data yet, how much is enforceable, but for big companies, it's probably enforceable. For individuals, it's harder to enforce.
It's interesting, right? Because it almost seems, in many regards, like a prisoner's dilemma. If you had cooperation, at least amongst Western countries, and cooperated, you could almost get to a situation where everyone sort of had the same sort of tax amounts. But to your point, the incentive to deviate for a Dubai, a Luxembourg, is very high, because then they offer very low tax rates. They bring for being it brings a lot of businesses up, and then suddenly everyone else would deviate, and then you get this sort of Pareto inefficient equilibrium where like no one's particularly paying as much tax on certain things. And so it's a hard problem. I think almost there's also, I think, some potential for simplifying certain processes as well, because I think as soon as you make, I think the incentive usually is to try and close certain loopholes and make things very, very difficult and very complicated. But unfortunately, usually when that happens, you usually then need quite highly educated lawyers or uh, workers or infrastructure in order to be able to administer those systems. And those things in themselves are very costly. I mean, just a simple cost that people don't necessarily take into account is if you're going to change percentage rates on NI or capital tax or even council tax, right? You are going to have to communicate that to all your citizens. And in the UK, we have a working population, maybe around 30 million or something, with 60 million people plus, right? You have to communicate those changes and communicate them effectively so everyone knows what's there is happening and is occurring. And that comes with a cost. That comes with advertising costs. That comes with time and administration and all the costs. And so it's a very difficult system. And I think it's led to this big surge, I think, in consideration recently in regards to wealth taxes in particular. You kind of touched on it briefly there, trying to move taxation away from income more to wealth generation. But to your point, I think there's going to be a lot of general resistance to those kind of things. And there's a variety of things that are certain challenges, but the proponents of will say is almost necessary for that redistribution effect to be pragmatic and effective.
So that is, if you think of that, is one thing which is related to one of our papers. One thing which is very hard in taxing wealth is in the United States. I know it is now the most typical businesses, even among the bigger businesses, are not on the stock market. They are kind of privately owned firms. If you think about privately owned firms, they are very important for the economy, for any economy, because they are, to a large extent, are engines of growth. These are the firms which start small, have a great idea, and build up on this great idea. They create new jobs, create new
markets, new opportunities,
new markets. So these are very important elements of our economic development. These firms, of course, are also key for wealth generation. If you were lucky and start one of the, I don't want to name names, but we know which some, they all started as very small enterprises in the high-tech industry in the United States or Estonia or the UK. And then now they are multi-billionaires. The problem is that this is, of course, at some point you want to tax them. But putting a very high tax is going to be, maybe this is, we don't worry too much about the distortions, but there is a big measurement issue. How you evaluate these entrepreneurs that the market doesn't evaluate. They have a company which we know it's successful, they have enough revenue, it's possible to tax the revenue. It's much harder to tax the wealth, because the wealth is in the company. This company doesn't have a market value. It would take enormous effort to have a nice market, nice kind of assessment of what is the wealth kind of embodied in these companies. So this is somehow, and there are a lot of wealth in these companies, and this is kind of, first we want to encourage companies to be privately owned companies, because as I said, they are very important for business dynamism, for the economic growth. At the same time, it would require a lot of resources to assess exactly how much wealth is for a comprehensive wealth test. That's why in most countries, like in the UK and the US, It's not completely true there is no wealth tax, because there is tax on real estate. Real estate is still not obvious how to evaluate, but we have good method and not so costly to methods to assess the value of a house. And then in the US, which doesn't have any official wealth tax, actually you pay a lot of local taxes on the basis of your real estate value. This is how local schools and other local services are financed. The UK, this is also, there is a local tax in Bristol and most other cities based upon real estate, because that is not so difficult to measure. So at the end, this gives some justification of have a wealth tax to some easy to measure activities, but then you worry about if you don't tax privately owned companies but tax stocks, then every company which is on the stock market will want to be a privately owned company just to avoid the taxation. So this is where we worry about incentives and distortions.
Yeah,
So this
and then
is
private equity comes in, and yeah,
exactly. So this is a hard problem. I think the wealth tax is probably going to happen in real estate, but real estate, that is, at least we know it's there. Then maybe they buy real estate in other countries, and then it's harder to catch. So this is always going to be a difficult, as you said. We will hire the best lawyers, and the government hire the best economists, and then they will try to figure out what is the best way, and that is not going to be easy to tax the super rich as much as you may want.
sure. And just to play the devil's advocate position here, to on this kind of subject, because you bring up a fantastic point there. So much of this actually comes down to what being able to measure and value things appropriately. And I think, generally speaking, and I could be speaking out of school to some degree, but generally why I think consumption taxes, income taxes corporation taxes tend to be the mechanisms by which we are at the higher levels of taxation, is because they're easily calculatable and in terms of their value. When you buy something at the supermarket, you are buying it for a value. It is very easy to put a 20% market on that because you have the value. When you get your salary, if you're paid £5,000 a month, that's a very quantifiable value that's already there. It's very easy to then add percentages onto those things. When you have things like stocks, ownership in equities, and things like that, you may have a valuation at a point in time for a house, for example, when you bought it, but you don't know the market conditions. You can make an estimate, but ultimately these things are down to supply and demand. And that's why, generally speaking, that you have capital gains taxes, because it again provides that sort of quantifiable value at the point of sale. But I think to play some level of devil's advocate, I think that's usually the reasons why. And I think what it highlights is actually just saying that we need wealth taxes and we need, or minimum taxes, or whatever that is, into certain degrees, doesn't eliminate the problem of being able to appropriately value and accurately be able to calculate those taxes and what they should be to what scale of certain things. Because ultimately, a company could be hypothetically worth something, but if it's in a high growth industry, it could also be gone tomorrow, and it might not have the real assets to back it up as well.
I agree completely, and sometimes you are right in there could be an extreme circumstance. They have a high value, but they don't have cash to pay the taxes because it's all in terms of future expected, and expected means still it's not certain. Expected risky the cash flows in the future. So these are all kind of, you use the word pragmatics, and these are very practical and pragmatic views of some type of taxation are difficult to implement, or even though it would be desirable in an optimal world, it would be desirable but they are not easy to implement. And this is the reason why, even though there are problems with taxing consumption income, this is much easier to measure. So that's even if you are one of the employees or CEO of one of these companies who don't have which high value, probably you pay yourself quite a bit. So there you can tax. So that is one pragmatic view of taxation, which makes wealth taxation harder. It's not impossible. There are Nordic countries. Norway is the best example, who has a wealth tax. It's interesting how things reinforce each other. So many research papers are written now in Norway because the fact that they have a wealth tax
it's very
implies that they have very good data to measure everybody's wealth. With all the caveats we mentioned, they try because they have to pay wealth taxes. So given this, and given they collect all this type of data, and in principle you can collect them, this made Norway is like one of the, after the United States, is still the most well studied in it, because that's kind of, there is still good data, and this is still a more important economy. Norway is one of the in the top 5 of studied economies because they have so good data, and because of the wealth tax, they have wealth data, which in the even the United States or the UK there is no good longitudinal data. Longitudinal meaning panel data, that you can observe individuals over time and see their wealth accumulation. This data, which is of course crucial for our research to understand what drives the wealth inequality. Why one person is more wealthy than another ones? Is it because they were born more wealthy, or they were saving more, or they are or they are working harder, or they are smarter? Turns out all the 4, by the way, all the 4 is contributing to become wealthier. But only Norway has the data when you can really study this in this way with the panel data.
Yeah. Also, just honestly, with Norway, really effective management or policy. Norway is such an interesting case study, generally speaking, because their ability to capture tax and effectively retain value from their natural resources, I think, is something that a lot of countries are at least trying to emulate, and sort of development of their sovereign wealth fund. But it's such a specific example. The location geographically within Europe and sort of in the Nordic area, access to natural resources, educated population, relatively small size, but not small enough to the point where it's sort of inconsequential. They've done an incredible job, particularly in the creation of the sovereign wealth fund and things like that. And if you've generally speaking, if you have a GDP per capita up sort of the hundreds of thousands, and you have sort of less wealth inequality, you can probably get away with a lot more things politically, I would imagine, as well. But it's a very interesting case study generally to look at.
What is interesting, it is true, I think, for Norway, that you are right in everything, with one small qualification. Actually, I think it's true for Norway, definitely true for Sweden. So these countries have relatively low post-tax income inequality, very low, relatively low consumption inequality, and especially relatively low rate of poverty. So, however, Sweden has a large wealth inequality. At the end, there is this genre of books called, I think, Scandinavian crime stories. And then you can, have you read any of that? You have seen they are always about the super rich. And if you see the Millennium TV series or movies, actually they were movies and TV series, Sweden has this very small amount of very rich people. So there is actually quite a bit of wealth inequality, but much less in terms of consumption and income inequality. Because wealth is somehow that it can be inherited. I mean, you could be lucky. You could be the one what is a Sweden? You could be the one who funded IKEA, I guess. Then you will become a millionaire, or Ericsson. So there are these families there living in the hillsides of the Swedish towns. So inequality in wealth is not small. It's much smaller in income and consumption, and there is much better equality in terms of equality of opportunity is stronger, because schools and universities are very homogeneous. There is much less difference in terms of the level of education, healthcare, which is definitely a huge problem with some other part of Western countries. Let's say the United States, and to some extent the United Kingdom. There is the equality of opportunity is much less provided by the systems. But I think Norway is specific because they have resources. Sweden is similar in many senses, and even without huge amount of resources, they managed to do something similar. Although Norway is kind of insured for the long run through the sovereign fund, because they have a lot of savings, which is not existing in Sweden and Denmark.
Of course. Go back to the research paper overall. Could you just briefly outline for me what your findings were and sort of the implications of the research?
So let's go back to the one I mentioned about social security, because it is in this research paper what we try to see how we could redesign social security system, meaning pension system, together with the tax system to achieve a higher social welfare. So there are a lot of ways to measure social welfare, but without going into detail, so the idea is that what we showed is that there are two ways, two very different ways to improve on the current system. It's based upon the numbers or based upon the United States. So I wouldn't be sure that exactly the same numbers would come out, but the conclusions I think are very interesting and very generalizable. So there are two ways to do it. One is making social security much less progressive. Actually, if anything, giving higher replacement rate for the higher earners. This one obviously is going to improve efficiency because now for the high productive agents, the ones who can find good jobs, they will have even more incentives to work hard and accumulate assets because that gives them very long-term perspective. This would increase it would increase the total economy, and through this everybody could gain. There is a bigger economy, more capital, more jobs, higher salaries. But this policy obviously is going to increase inequality because we are going to move from a progressive system which is supporting the long-term old age consumption of the lower income people. We are moving away, which is going to have higher income of the higher earnings people. So that is one policy which is going to increase inequality, but is going to generate a bigger economy, a larger economy, and higher salary for everybody. But there is a completely different type of policy, which is actually making the pension system even more progressive. And then it's going to and then kind of make it more generous to some extent. This policy, on the other hand, is going to make kind of almost all of the lower paid people better off. Why? Because they are going to be entitled to have higher pensions and they don't have to work as much during the working life and then have relatively low consumption and working a lot. You can smooth out through the public system much better the life cycle consumption, uh, but it is going to distort the economy. Given that the system is giving so little benefits for the rich, they are going to work less, and then we are going to have a smaller economy. This is also increasing social welfare, but a completely different political implications. The first one would get a huge majority support, meaning 75% would support, only the poor wouldn't support it. While the second one also can create a huge political support, but only the rich would be against that. So it's a very much a political question. So this shows, going back to our first point, do you want to increase? You can make popular policies, but the question is, what is your objective? Having a bigger economy where kind of the rich and the middle class is happy, but the poor is left behind, or you make an economy which is actually not going to be really bigger, and then the middle class and the low income people are going to be behind it because they are getting high insurance, but the rich is going to be. And what is new in this paper is that first, both of them are better than the status quo, surprisingly. Second, you don't really have to move too much the taxes for this. You can do all of this just changing the pension system. The pension system is a very interesting instrument because it is all the distortions coming through that they are kind of delayed. You have all your working life. If I change your pension system next now, you are a young person. You can change your lifetime savings behavior. You can work a bit more. You are able to adjust it. While I change the incomes, you are already immediately affected. There is not much you can change. It is not as much as a surprise. So, as opposed to changing tax progressivity, changing the pension system seems to be uh, an instrument which is going to be able to create larger welfare gains, because you have all the life cycle to adjust behavior and kind of adapt to this new system. So this is kind of one relatively intriguing paper. So sometimes you know what you expect from a paper. When we started this paper, we had no idea. We saw that it's going to be either a bad idea or a good idea to do a progressive tax system. What we learned is something kind of different. Depends what is your social objective. If your objective is very much against inequality, you can improve welfare one way. If you really go for efficiency, growth, you do another policy, but they are kind of drastically different. But both can gain popular support. So you can see why sometimes political parties go with very different agendas, because they can, but the constituencies are different. There is another element of the paper which I don't talk now, but you have to worry about current and future as well, which that the paper also talks about it, because we talk about social security. Some policies may benefit the current and not benefit the future generations, and other way around. So we also talk that much about the paper, but the main conclusions remain the same independently of this. So in this paper, what kind of from the economic research point of view, what is really new and interesting, that there is a lot of paper talk about the optimal progressivity or regressivity of income taxes. And they don't talk about pensions at all, or they have a very reviews for modeling pensions. Now, if you do it together, there are much broader set of instruments you can achieve combinations of redistribution and efficiency in a better way. I talk a bit longer on this, so I'll let you ask questions now on this.
No, I think it's very interesting. I think one of the things you mentioned there as well is having the consistency over the long term to be able to effectively plan as in accordance with that tax policy as well. And what I would imagine is the other layer to this. And you talked to there about having different political parties with different angles of which they'll approach the methodologies that you mentioned. Having inconsistency or uncertainty over whichever the methodologies, to your point, that you use, I would also imagine massively limits the ability for that scheme to be effective in its nature. So, particularly when you talk about sort of being able to plan over several generations, or just be able to effectively communicate, people to become accustomed to it and be able to plan their lives appropriately and, like I say, build and grow businesses, but also manage their own households.
So this is kind of a very interesting point, and one way to tell you how economic research works. I have other papers when I really focus on this economic uncertainty, not so much in this one, because this is kind of indeed a key element. So let me tell you two things about it. Now, number one thing we do in this paper, and then I move to kind of to element of uncertainty more into that. So one thing we do in this paper is indeed, this is one of our big dilemmas in our society in many ways. One is, of course, which we will not talk about, is kind of climate change and the effects of kind of long-term climate change and how does it relate to taxes. The other one, this is the same with social security. You could have amazing systems for the current generations, but they will be systems which are going to depleting our capital stock or kind of the future, and the future generations are going to be worse off. So in this paper, we really take care of it. So we are going to put constraint, if you say, in terms of design. When you design the new pension system or new tax system, we make sure that future generations are not worse off. Right? We can put that in, and that puts some constraint. It is what I said is still true. You can do less because this is a relevant constraint. Many of our policies would be kind of carpe diem. Let's try to do everything good now, and then given we discount the future, we don't care that much about the future. So that's a very relevant constraint in many economic policies, and many research papers may need to worry about this, that it is kind of, you cannot really have policies on environmental, kind of the whole climate change and environmental economics is built up in this idea that you really have to make sure that you have long-term sustainability. So and we do this in this paper, but we don't do that much about the uncertainty. The uncertainty is critical because as economists, we have to worry about that whatever policy you do, things can get worse, and then this is going to affect, whenever we do macroeconomics of the type I do, macroeconomics with heterogeneous agents, when there are going to be people who are both because of initial conditions or because of luck, end up to be poorer and richer, this uncertainty might affect them differently. And then we have two big crises in the last, 15 years. Yeah, 15 still fits in with the Great Recession, and you could see that
COVID in 2008, right?
Exactly. So these are two, and you can see that different parts of the society were affected very differently. So the first crisis was a lot of people lost asset value. So in some sense, housing prices dropped. So this could say that it hurt more the rich. I did qualify the statement, but to some extent it's true. Housing values lost. So if you're a poor person in 2009 buying a house, you could get it cheaper than in 2006. So that was true in the United States. So if you had resources to buy a house, you could get it cheaper, although the interest rates might have been higher. But at least the house values went down. You lose asset value, but of course it is not true. The Great Recession also created huge unemployment. And unemployment is typically hitting the more vulnerable part of the society, are kind of the low income people. So this is true. COVID, on the other hand, had smaller financial consequences, but a lot of people were without a job. So forgetting about policies in the UK and the US, really the low income people who were lost their jobs more importantly, and there was smaller impact on the financial and housing values actually, if anything, didn't go down and they went up very fast after that. So you can see that different type of uncertainty affects age households very differently. The last 40 years are very interesting in some sense. Before the Great Recession, people thought about the Great Moderation. There were 30 years when uncertainty in the United States and most of European countries were very low. We had inflation very stable, economic growth very stable, unemployment fluctuated, but not too much, especially in the United States. Europe was a bit worse, the UK, but there were really very little. So at that point, people started to worry more about growth and inequality and much less about shocks because there were not some. There was one shock in 2000, the dot-com bubble. It really, if you see unemployment and everything, it didn't make. It was a very small blip. But now, after COVID and the Great Recession, we are thinking about differently. This is not so much recurring similar cycles. There could be really big shocks, and these big shocks are difficult to predict. Even the Great Recession was difficult to predict. Obviously, COVID it was difficult to predict because we haven't seen anything like this in the
Yeah, just
modern
a
economy. So
complete
it is
complete black swan event. Yeah, just
exactly so now we really, and this is why it's hard to think about. It is something which macroeconomics has works on a lot of things people don't think it works. We work a lot on inequality, we work a lot on redistribution, all this. But we have hard time to figure out how to think about cycles and crises. Because the last two ones were is kind of different than the typical going up and down. They were kind of relatively unexpected. Actually, I would say both were very unexpected. The Great Recession was expected for a 6 month window or something like this. Before it was really not. So, and how to worry about it is harder. So this is you are right. We should really worry about it and run through this one, but it's not that easy. And I think this is going to be one new direction of macroeconomists to go back to some old ideas, some kind of worst case scenario. You run your average, and what if something bad happens, which is similar to the Great Recession and the COVID? And I would encourage you or everybody who ever listened to this to think about how we can do. You can do it with kind of what happens with GDP, but what is really hard, what happens if you look at the whole spectrum of the economy, from the firm owners to the workers to the retired and all this, how they are affected by this. I mean, COVID is kind of, it was affected very differently both because the economic forces and the pandemic forces. Of course, the old was more vulnerable, but they didn't lose their job. So this is kind of why the young lost their jobs. Some of them were more vulnerable. There are a lot of almost natural experiments in the United States. Lockdown were very different in Texas versus New York. So there are a lot of things which we can learn from this. And what we learn is that kind of we need to prepare for big crises which can come kind of out of sudden. And that is why it's not so easy to answer your questions. In one paper, we dealt with one uncertainty that tax policies are changed because of the political uncertainty. That practically there are, whatever tax policy you put in, it can be as a kind of a player in that paper, it was firms, but it could be, in another paper, could be households with social security or for tax progressivity. These are the ones which are always on the political agenda. Tax progressivity, how much we tax the rich, how much we tax the poor. So you need to know that it might, whatever you think today is a tax rate or whatever is a tax rate today, it can change. If they put a reform in the US, there is a form or procedure of reform is not permanent for a while. It's permanent after 8 years or 10 years, there is usually a whole timeline when the House has to make it permanent. So this is something which most economic models don't incorporate. And what we showed there in that paper about corporate taxes, that it makes a lot of difference. Because if you know that the tax can be withdrawn, you have an arbitrage opportunity to some extent. You know that the corporate tax is low now, but it can be high tomorrow. Then you really try to make profits today as much as possible. You try to make a bit more profits today, and and then don't pay dividends because now corporate taxes are low. You can or you pay dividends is kind of irrelevant, the dividend part for this. So there are a lot of tax arbitrage opportunities you create by putting this policy uncertainty. That the deeper levels of uncertainties, we have less understanding of how to do it because the last two big crises taught us something that we don't really know. It's difficult to where exactly they are coming. They can come from anywhere. That's kind of.
And I think this is where risk actually comes into a lot more to the point. If we have a lot less uncertainty about future economic projections, but also just if black swan events are becoming more frequent or erratic in terms of the cycle structure, I think there almost has to be an accompanying change in the way that we look at these governmental policy when we look at these things to some degree de-risk on a lot of aspects, because ultimately if you do recognize that you can't predict these things to the degree that you used to, or there is going to be an increased level of volatility or unpredictability, I think it's incumbent on governing organizations to take that into account when deciding policy. So particularly with things like the national debt and things like that, if we're already at, for example, 100% of GDP in terms of national debt, that already puts you in a position where you can't extensively borrow over an extended period of time without serious consequences. And I do wonder sometimes, particularly with the way there's been relative stagnative growth, aging demographics and the associated costs with that, lower both birth rates, that given that stagnant growth, governments and organizations across Western economies are looking for ways to try and stimulate growth. And my worry is that they're going to some degree disregard the amount of risk that they're taking on, so that if we do see these kind of cycle changes that we're seeing, that there is going to be more of these black swan events and could really, really do some damage and disrupt the economy quite significantly. I mean, the truth of the matter is COVID-19 came out of nowhere, and people give a lot of criticism to for example, the Conservative government in the UK for trying to, budget deficit from 2008. And that has certain consequences as well, repercussions. But we also had to do a lot of increase of the national debt in order to pay for a lot of the COVID policies and interactions. And what you have to also appreciate is that if we hadn't have taken that policy beforehand, our national debt would be in a worse position now than it would have been if we continued to borrow at those increasingly very low interest rates. And so I think my concern, particularly in that regard, is just the acknowledgement and risk mitigation that the economic organizations and governments are doing, particularly when it comes to things like tax policies and also just how they're running general government and economies.
I agree. I think this is somehow a harder topic, I think, because I at the same time the risks are difficult to quantify because Japan is kind of a good example. Japan,
real canary in the coal mine on that one.
They are going to have 200, I think somehow 200%, and they seem to go well. And they are also a great example of they had great plans of spending on many things which didn't work. But somehow they still that is sustainable. So what level that is sustainable depends on the country. Argentina cannot run more than 20. This is the example I always say. Argentina 20% of that, everybody worried about they will default. Japan has 200% of that, and nobody thinks that Japan will not. And Italy has By the way, Italy, which is somehow in between, is also often have around 100%. So this is kind of what is sustainable and what is not sustainable is hard. What you are completely right is that whatever policy you would either on the tax side, or financing side, or on the expenditure side, there is a lot of risk. And then that risk has to be taken into account, because if you really design your policies badly on the revenue side, meaning the spending side, in the spending side, that will not generate extra growth, and then you increase the debt, and the financing needs are going to increase. And this risk is critical, and but it's difficult to convince politicians. This is somehow we have an independent central bank. It would, to some extent, it would be useful to have an independent authority who is kind of dealing with financing the government. It exists in some countries. In the Netherlands, whenever a government budget, there is an independent agency which is independent of the government, is going to have a report on all important items of a government budget, including issuing new debt, just to make sure about sustainability and assessing the risk. This type of agency doesn't exist in most countries, and my best guess is for political reasons. Politicians don't like to tie their hands, because at the end they might have all
not be able to pull that lever if they need
exactly.
to.
Exactly. So that's the problem. In the US, they managed to do one thing, which is in many states, not the federal government, they cannot borrow. So that is a very extreme sense. It is too much. They take away all the flexibility, but for this reason. They wanted to avoid that for political reasons. They are going to be a lot in trouble. I'm Hungarian origin, and the Hungarian constitution has like a debt limit. But there is a kind of a loop. It's an official loophole, and after 1 year they put this into the constitution. We are always through the loophole, above the limit. So that is the problem, because it's not their political interest to keep it low. And by the way, economically, you also want some flexibility. Sometimes you don't want to do austerity. Austerity has a lot of cost in the long run. So sometimes it's a good idea. Like COVID, I agree with you. It's good that they manage, because otherwise it would have been much worse if they don't let more government debt. So you want to have this. So it is a difficult one, but I think I agree with you. A lot of these policies are not proper risk assessment, and what we learned in the last two recessions, these risks they are not small. We thought about looking at the previous 20 years, there were small shocks. People said, okay, the worst case scenario is not too bad. But what we saw that the worst case can be pretty bad. And then it is, I don't know how much, because I'm not that involved, to be fair, at all about treasuries, but this should be and economic research, I think we are going towards that direction. It is not easy to do, because we need to work with models of the unknown. Now there is a new area of macroeconomics which are going to deal with situations when we don't know the possible distributions, how bad the shocks could be. We are not aware how bad shocks can come, because partially motivated these recent episodes. But these models haven't met yet the models I'm working with heterogeneous agents. There are some of these I'm not so familiar, but this is an area which is, I think it's a very important one to have policy design, because this type of risks due to climate change and then to see that the financial system being sophisticated might mean there is more systematic risk as well. That's kind of seems to be financial engineering has a lot of advantages, but increased our risk. For me, that's the message of the Great Recession. Then COVID says that's just whatever modern science does, all of a sudden a virus can create a lot of troubles. And climate change is showing us that there is more volatility, at least at national level, everywhere. So I think we need to be prepared for it. And I think economic research is going that direction, but this is kind of a difficult problem to tackle. So don't expect that we will immediately come out with amazing solutions how to manage risk. And governments may not want to listen to that, because they have their own political motivations behind some of those policies.
No, certainly. Given some of the things that we've talked about there, the nuances with different political organizations coming into power, the effect of aging demographics, and some of the other things that we've mentioned, how do you see UK tax policy changing over the next 5 to 10 years?
I don't try to be bold, but given that I don't know all the details, I might say a bold statement. I think the UK there is a problem on the revenue and the spending side. UK has a very unique but costly health system, which is fully government financed, the NHS. Uh, they have there is a relatively extensive transfer system, kind of social welfare transfer system. There are different levels of mean testing, and there is the public education. All this. This is actually difficult to finance, and and the personal income taxes can increase, but cannot increase that much without starting to be too distortionary, I think. So it's not obvious how to fix it only through the tax side. They might have to think about, unfortunately, on the spending side. And given that we have an aging society here as well, and not a particularly healthy society, this is going to be a difficult one.
Very
And I
difficult. Very,
and I
very difficult.
really I'm not so sure whether the progressivity of the tax or the pension system is easy to make in a way to create more revenue out of it. I think you can probably tax a bit more capital income and wealth one way or another, but I don't think we talk about there is a lot realistic potential
It's
in
not
there.
going to do as much as it
And,
needs to.
so I think honestly, the spending side, this is they start to think about it, then they will have to think about the spending side. I'm not expert of any of the big spending part, but I think that might have to be the way to think about, which is politically very difficult, especially for a Labour government, especially for a Labour government whose typical objective is exactly the opposite.
Well, to be honest with you, I would say even for a conservative or a reform or another government, a lot of the things that we've talked about there in terms of the spending, a lot of it does go on post 65 care, whether that be healthcare, elderly care, facilities in that regard. Our dependency ratio is getting much higher, at least in terms of the old age pensioner ratio compared to at least the younger population. And as we know, as that population grows in size, that portion of the population is also very politically active, despite their size. And so adjusting spending, particularly in that area, is going to be very difficult. But it's something that certainly has to be addressed, at least to some degree, if we are going to de-risk, at least. So that's some of the points that you've mentioned there. Just to wrap this up, then, we've touched on a couple of your research papers there and that have concentrated around a lot of this tax policy. If there was a piece of research that could be conducted in the future to best capitalize on some of the findings that you've had across some of these research papers, what would it address? What would be its objectives be? And what would it be looking out for?
I mean, I think one of the most important questions for practically all Western countries, the US is a little bit shielded away, is I just want to follow up on your thing, is that how we are going to do this transition towards a very different society with which kind of and the non-working population, meaning the elderly, is having a much higher share of the population, and in this sense, I has a higher financial pressure on all government budgets. What type of policies can alleviate this and get good outcomes for this part of the society and still keep the right incentives for the working age population to work? Meaning how we should co-finance. I think the idea is that a lot of the policies, even France, which is kind of a European country, health system, there is a co-financing. There is some part which is coming out of pocket and some other part is coming from the general system. Is there a design general, independent of the UK, because it's a problem everywhere, from Japan to China to UK, even the US. But the US is somehow still a younger and slower aging society until Trump, because immigration was a
Migration,
force.
yeah.
If there is no immigration, who knows? They might be getting very similar to continent, to Europe and the UK. See, what is the? I would say that let's start to think about the spending side and the financing side together to figure out a better way to make sure that we provide nice, sustainable, and high quality outcomes for the elderly, and at the same time it's going to create enough incentives for the working age population to work and having maintaining their living standards, which is, I think, it is a question. And then there are a few papers talking about maybe the financing side or the spending side, but not the two together. And co-financing exactly means you should think about how to do the two together. There are examples, but so far these examples are only available for the very rich, I think. So that is somehow how we can expand that for the bigger spectrum of society. Some people will have to be coming through publicly financed facilities, but how we can do some co-financing which includes quality and experience, that I think is an important applied topic for the future. Uh, and then there is, and as you said, to make it resilient to potential crisis in terms of financial or other type of crisis.
Hmm.
That is, I think, something which we have to work on as macroeconomists and public economists in the future.
Certainly. Arpad, thank you very much for your time. I've really enjoyed this. I'll have links to your research down in the description and stuff, but I just want to say thank you for your time. I really appreciate it.